Welcome, everyone, to the History Program. During the fierce bombing days over Vietnam, one of the most tragic fates belonged to Lieutenant Alvarez, the first American pilot ever shot down over North Vietnam. When he was captured, Alvarez was only 26 years old and had been married for just 6 months. Not long after being imprisoned, he found himself in a heartbreaking situation when news came from Florida. His young wife had filed for divorce to seek a new life. At that time, the United States looked down on the Vietnamese army. They believed that since the Soviet Union had only started providing weapons in 1965, it would take at least a year before these peasants, who had barely seen a radio, could possibly learn to operate missiles effectively. But to their shock, within just 3 months, the Vietnamese troops were already shooting down American aircraft left and right. Between 1965 and 1966, U.S. planes fell like rain. According to U.S. records, by the end of 1965, 61 pilots had been captured. In 1966, on average, every 10 days saw 8 American planes shot down, and 86 more pilots added to the register at Hanoi's Hỏa Lò Prison. At that time, the captured pilots had many stories that were both tragic and ironic. One of them was Richard Pouquian, perhaps the unluckiest pilot in American history. During World War II, on his very first bombing mission over Germany, he was shot down and spent 9 months as a prisoner of war. You'd think he learned his lesson. But years later, in Vietnam, after only a few hours of flying on orders from his superiors, he was shot down again, and this time spent 10 long years in Hỏa Lò Prison. Pouquian's story was unfortunate, but it still pales in comparison to that of Robinson Wisner, a celebrated American hero of the Korean War. Wisner had completed 109 successful combat missions and logged over 3.000 flight hours, a record few could ever achieve. Yet when he came to Vietnam, he was shot down on just his 5th mission. After his plane caught fire, Wisner managed to eject over the sea and was rescued by U.S. forces. The American media immediately turned him into a legend. Time magazine even put his photo on the front page, hailing him as a national hero. But only a short time later, on September 16, 1965, the same hero was shot down again, this time over Thanh Hoa, and sent to live in Hỏa Lò Prison for the next 7.5 years. From that day on, American media went completely silent about their fallen hero. By then, the number of captured American pilots in Vietnam had grown alarmingly high. Many were the sons of influential families, creating enormous pressure on the Paris peace negotiations. Desperate to rescue them, the U.S. began planning an elaborate operation. The intelligence work to locate the prisoners had already been covered in previous accounts. But how they selected and trained the special forces for the rescue mission, that's a story few people know. The recruitment was done entirely on a voluntary basis. No soldier knew where he was going, what he would do, or why, only that the mission would be extremely dangerous. Once the initial list was drawn up, commanders went through each name carefully. Anyone newly married or expecting a child was immediately removed. They wanted men with no emotional distractions, fully devoted to the mission. After selection came a peculiar interview round. It didn't serve any real evaluative purpose. Instead, it was meant to confuse the soldiers about their true mission. Each man was asked random questions such as, "Do you know how to ski? How long can you walk across the desert without water? Does your skin burn easily in the sun?" Of course, the men would later talk among themselves, trying to piece the clues together. With the operation code named Ivory Coast, most assumed they were headed to the Middle East or Africa. No one imagined Vietnam. The mission was classified at the highest level. Only President Nixon, National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, and a few senior cabinet members were aware of it. Even South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thu and his top generals knew nothing, not even after the mission was over. Once reconnaissance and recruitment were complete, the U.S. began a brutal phase of training to prepare for the raid. Pilots practiced flying extremely low, skimming treetops and weaving through valleys to avoid radar detection. This was hard enough for helicopter crews, but for transport pilots flying massive C-130s, it was nearly impossible. These aircraft had to fly slowly to guide the helicopters. And if even one of their 4 engines fell out of sync, the plane could crash instantly, too low for parachutes to open. As if that weren't enough, they had to fly at night, under dim moonlight, with complete radio silence. One small mistake, a moment's miscalculation, could send a plane crashing into a mountain or another aircraft. On the ground, the commandos trained for absolute precision. Every movement, every second, every centimeter mattered. Step out of position by even 1 foot, or miss the timing by 1 second, and you could end up shot by your own teammate. Each target representing Vietnamese soldiers had to be riddled with bullet holes to be considered a success. Anyone who failed 3 times was dismissed from the team. Beyond marksmanship, they practiced lock-breaking, cutting hinges, severing chains with torches, and carrying mock prisoners out of the compound, often played by officers posing as hostages. The Americans even prepared for the worst-case scenario, that some POWs might have gone insane after years of captivity. So the team included a doctor responsible for immediate medical care. They stocked warm clothes, blankets, rubber sandals, and specialized medication, because the deafening roar of helicopter engines could easily send long-imprisoned men into panic. With everything ready, only one question remained: when to strike? According to the planners, the ideal time would be under clear skies and bright moonlight. In 1970, that window fell between November 20th and November 25th. Waiting until the following year was impossible. Public outrage in the U.S. was already boiling over, demanding action. The final decision: the raid would take place on the night of November 20th. But just hours before the operation, on the afternoon of November 19th, American intelligence sent a chilling message. All prisoners have been moved elsewhere. So, was the raid still carried out? What really happened that night? All will be revealed in the next episode of History. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next incredible story from history.